Hello everyone and welcome back to Panik Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. I've always been a fan of driving at night. The quiet, the solitude, it gives me time to think. But tonight, the road felt different. The chill in the air seemed to seep into my bones as the headlights of my car illuminated an endless stretch of asphalt. No streetlights, no signs of civilization, just me and the road. I had taken this back road to cut through the woods, a shortcut that had always been peaceful in the past. But tonight, something felt off. The deeper I drove, the more the trees seemed to crowd in on me, their branches clawing at the sky like twisted fingers. There was a heaviness in the air, something that made my heart beat just a little faster. And then, my car sputtered. It wasn't a sudden stop, no, it was a slow, ominous chugging before the engine died, leaving me in the middle of nowhere, stranded. I tried to start it again, hoping it was just a fluke. But nothing. I could hear the low hum of the engine, but there was no turning over, no power. My phone was dead, and I couldn't even pick up a signal. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized how far I was from any town. My only option was to get out and walk, but the darkness surrounding me was so thick it almost felt like I could reach out and touch it. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm myself, then grabbed my jacket and locked the car behind me. The night air bit at my skin, making me shiver, but I had no choice. I began walking, my footsteps crunching over the gravel. The trees towered over me, and the sound of my breath seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. I looked ahead, hoping to see any signs of life, but the road stretched on in both directions, endless and empty. I was about to turn back when I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. My heart skipped a beat. A house. A flicker of light in the vast blackness of the woods. I was relieved but cautious. The house was old, and its shape seemed more like a silhouette than a real building. It stood on the edge of the woods, isolated and weather-worn, like it had been there for a century or more. The faint glow seemed to come from a single window, casting an odd, yellowish hue. As I walked closer, I felt a strange chill, one that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was as if the house itself was exuding something, an energy I couldn't explain. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. My car had broken down, and I needed to call for help. I knocked on the door, my knuckles rapping softly against the old wood. For a moment, there was no response. I was about to turn away when I heard a faint shuffle from inside, followed by the slow creak of a door opening. An old man stood in the doorway, his hunched back almost bent in half, his clothes ragged and faded. His skin was pale, too pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were wide, unnervingly wide. They stared at me without blinking, and his mouth curved into a slow, unsettling smile. "You look lost, traveler," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. I'm sorry, my car broke down. I was hoping I could use your phone to call for help," I said, my voice trembling just a little. He didn't say anything for a long time, his gaze scanning me, as though reading me, searching for something. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the rising unease in my gut. Finally, he stepped aside, his hand lingering on the doorframe, almost as if he were inviting me into a different world. "Come in, then. Come in out of the cold," he said, his voice low but thick with an odd, welcoming warmth. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to leave, to turn and run back down the road. But what other choice did I have? I stepped inside, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something foul. The walls were lined with dark, peeling wallpaper, the kind that had been there so long it seemed like part of the house itself. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I couldn't help but notice how the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though they were alive, shifting in the corners. "Please, sit. Make yourself comfortable," the old man croaked, gesturing toward a threadbare armchair by the fireplace. The flames inside were small, weak, casting long, jittery shadows that flickered across the walls. I wanted to leave. My feet were frozen, my body refusing to move, but I couldn't look rude. I sat down, the old chair groaning beneath me, and tried to steady my nerves. "You can use the phone," the old man said, his voice a raspy whisper. He pointed to a dusty rotary phone on a small table beside me. I got up, eager to call for help, but as I reached for the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I dialed the number. Nothing. No dial tone. Just silence. I tried again, turning the dial with trembling fingers, but the result was the same, nothing. My heart was racing now, panic threatening to overwhelm me. "Is there something wrong with the phone?" I asked, looking back at the old man. But when I turned around, he was gone. I froze, staring at the empty hallway where he had just been. My pulse thudded in my ears as the silence pressed in. The house felt colder, darker, the shadows thicker. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Sir?" No answer. I turned toward the door, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but it slammed shut with an awful thud before I could reach it. My heart lurched in my chest. I ran to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The handle rattled in my grip, but the door was locked, sealed shut from the other side. I was trapped. I spun around, my eyes darting wildly. The house felt alive now, groaning, creaking, breathing. The walls seemed to pulse with some strange, hidden rhythm. I could hear footsteps, faint at first, but then louder, closer, as if someone, or something, was moving just behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just the shadows. "Don't be afraid," a voice whispered behind me. I whirled around again, my breath catching in my throat, but the old man was standing just behind me, his eyes wide, his breath heavy. "You've been here before," he whispered, his voice thick with a strange, twisted glee. "And you'll be here again." Before I could react, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength, pulling me toward the back of the house. I struggled, but his grip was unyielding. He dragged me down the hallway, toward a door I hadn't noticed before, a door that stood slightly ajar. A low, guttural sound came from behind it, a deep, resonating breathing that shook the very air. The door creaked open, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply, the air turning cold enough to see my breath. Inside, I saw movement, dark shapes shifting just out of sight. My heart raced, my mind screamed for me to turn and run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. My legs were like lead, frozen in place by some unseen force. "You're never leaving," the old man hissed, his voice filled with a sick pleasure. And in that moment, I understood. I was not the first to be trapped here. Nor would I be the last. The door swung fully open, revealing the dark shapes, creatures, no, things, that had been waiting. The shadows in the room shifted and writhed as if alive, and the air was thick with the stench of rot and decay. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the suffocating darkness. And just like that, I became another shadow in the house, the only house on the road. The last thing I remember was the old man's grin, twisted and cruel, his gnarled hand wrapping tighter around my arm. Then, the cold darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke up, I was no longer in the hallway. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. The house had changed, twisted into something darker, something more oppressive. The walls, once peeling and faded, were now slick with an unnatural dampness. The air smelled thick, suffocating, like mildew and rot. I tried to move, but my body felt sluggish, heavy, as though I were encased in something that wasn't quite flesh. I stumbled to my feet, my head spinning. The house seemed to hum with life around me, the creaking of the floorboards, the distant scraping of nails on wood. I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the house that was alive. It was the thing inside, the darkness that had always been there, waiting, feeding. I tried the door again. No use. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The house, it seemed, had grown around me, trapping me in a prison of shadow and memory. I could feel the eyes of the house watching me, the very walls knowing me. I thought of the old man. Had he really been human? Was he the one who trapped all those who wandered too close to this forsaken place? Or was he just another puppet of the house, like me? Suddenly, I heard it, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving unnaturally fast. It was the old man, but something was wrong. His body was thinner now, more skeletal, and his eyes. They glowed, a sickly, yellow light that pierced the darkness. "You found your place," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper, yet it rang in my ears like a death knell. I backed away, stumbling over the floor, my hands pressing against the walls, but they felt wrong, as though they were breathing beneath my fingers. The old man's form grew taller, the darkness shifting around him, taking shape like a living thing. "You'll stay here now," he murmured. "Just like the others. Forever." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed up, devoured by the shadows that had come alive. The house was hungry. It had always been hungry. And just like that, I realized the truth. I had never truly left. This house, this cursed place, had claimed me. I was now a part of it, just another lost soul wandering its endless corridors. I could feel it, the pull of the house, drawing me in deeper with every breath. I was never meant to leave. And now, I was one of them. The shadows embraced me, pulling me further into the darkness, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the old man's grin, wide and knowing. The only house on the road had claimed another victim. And I would never be the last. I thought it would be a simple hike, just a quick escape from the city. A few hours in the woods to clear my head. The map seemed straightforward enough, and the weather was perfect, cool, crisp air and not a cloud in the sky. But somewhere along the trail, something went wrong. I don't know when I veered off course, or when I started to feel the strange unease creeping in. Maybe it was when the trail started to thin out, or when the trees seemed to grow taller, their trunks twisting in odd angles, blocking the light. It didn't matter. I wasn't worried at first. I figured I'd find my way back soon enough. But as the minutes stretched into hours, and the shadows lengthened around me, the sense of being watched, of something else lurking just out of sight, grew too intense to ignore. And then, when the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, that's when it started. The whispering. The faint voices, carrying through the trees, like they were calling to me. It was so quiet at first that I thought it was the wind. But the more I listened, the more I realized, the forest had eyes. And they were watching me. I slowed my pace, my feet dragging as I scanned the woods around me. The trees seemed to shift, bending in unnatural ways, as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, and I stopped, straining to hear. It wasn't just the wind. There was someone there. Rachel. I froze. My name, clear as day, spoken in a voice that sent chills running up my spine. No one was around. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a hiker or a ranger, someone who could guide me back to the path. But there was no one. Only the twisted trees and thickening darkness. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The only response was the rustling of leaves, and then, once again, a whisper, fainter this time, but unmistakable. "Rachel." I took a step back, a bead of cold sweat forming on my forehead. The voice was too clear, too real to be the wind. It sounded like it was coming from the trees themselves. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. Silence fell over the woods. The kind of silence that presses in on you, making it hard to breathe. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I swallowed hard, trying to force my feet to move, to turn around and leave this place, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like the forest had a grip on me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. Then, from the shadows between the trees, a figure stepped forward. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light, a shadow that had taken shape. But no, there was something there, something tall, too tall, standing unnaturally still, as though it had been waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel its eyes on me, heavy and unblinking, though I couldn't see its face. The air grew colder, and my legs felt weak. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't move. "Rachel," the voice murmured again, but now it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, soft and slow, like it had been speaking for centuries. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, trying to get away, but every direction I turned, the trees seemed to close in on me. The trail was gone. The forest was endless, an oppressive sea of shadows, all of it watching, listening. The whispers began again, a chorus of voices all speaking at once, like 1,000 thoughts all trying to break through at once. "Leave now, one voice hissed. "You're not alone, it's too late, help her, I covered my ears, desperate to block it all out, but the voices only grew louder, more frantic. I started running, not caring where I was going, only that I had to escape. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart thundering in my chest. The trees closed in tighter, like the woods themselves were pushing me in one direction. I tripped, falling hard to the ground, the breath knocked out of me. But when I looked up, the figure was standing there again, closer now. I could see its outline against the dimming light, tall, skeletal, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch out from its body. And then, its voice, low and cold, echoed in my mind. "You're lost." It wasn't the same voice anymore, it was something darker, something ancient. Something that had been in these woods long before I was born, something that would outlast me, too. "Please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Please, let me go." The figure stepped closer, its form flickering like a flame in the wind, impossibly fast. I scrambled backward, but I was already too tired, too terrified. I could feel the forest closing in on me, trapping me. A sudden, sharp chill brushed against my neck, and I felt something cold, like fingers, slip across my skin. My body went rigid, the air thick with a sense of dread. "You're mine now," the voice murmured directly in my ear. And in that moment, I felt it, the weight of something unseen, a presence so strong, so ancient, that it crushed the air from my lungs. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring into the empty eyes of the thing that stood before me. The forest had taken its hold, and there was no escaping it. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the faintest whisper. The forest always has eyes, asterisk. When I woke, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. The forest around me was eerily still, the air thick with an unnatural silence. The sky above was dark now, the stars hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, drained, as though I had been asleep for days. Or maybe, something else entirely. I looked around, and my heart sank. The trail I had been following was gone, erased. All that remained was an endless sea of trees stretching in every direction, their twisted forms pressing in like they were suffocating me. I stood, swaying, and tried to remember how I had gotten here, how long I had been lost. But the memory was blurry, like a dream I couldn't quite grasp. The whispers had faded, but I could still feel them, lingering at the edge of my mind, as if the forest itself was speaking to me, coaxing me to stay. I stumbled forward, my legs unsteady beneath me, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispers weren't gone. They had changed, now more like a distant murmur, soft and insistent. Come back, they seemed to say, like 1,000 voices calling me from the depths of the trees. I stopped. My body froze, and in that stillness, I heard it. The crunch of leaves. A faint, deliberate step. I turned slowly, dread crawling up my spine. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, hunched silhouette, its face obscured by darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. Rachel. The voice was low, soft, and filled with a sickening sweetness. I couldn't move. I was trapped. The woods had claimed me. And then I understood. The whispers weren't meant to lead me out. They weren't meant to help me. They were waiting for me to find my way deeper, to let the forest take me. I could feel the weight of eyes on me from every angle, watching, waiting. I was no longer the lost hiker, the confused traveler. I was the prey, the one they had been calling for all this time. The forest had eyes. And it never let go. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend, a break from the noise of the city, a chance to escape to a quiet, remote cabin tucked away in the woods. I had spent weeks planning this getaway, imagining peaceful days spent reading by the fire, hiking through the woods, and peaceful nights under the stars. It was just me, alone, in the stillness of nature. But from the moment I arrived, something felt off. The air was too still, the trees too quiet. The cabin was older than I had imagined, its wooden walls creaking with every gust of wind. I chalked it up to nerves. Being alone in the middle of nowhere, with no one around for miles, was enough to make anyone feel uneasy. I tried to shake the feeling, reminding myself that this was supposed to be a retreat, a chance to escape from the noise of everyday life. I set up my things, made some tea, and curled up on the couch with a book. But no matter how hard I tried, a strange sense of foreboding clung to the air, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes, as if I wasn't truly alone. Night fell quickly, the dark creeping in around the edges of the cabin. The fire crackled weakly in the stone hearth, its warmth offering a sense of comfort. The wind outside howled through the trees, making the branches scrape against the windows like bony fingers. It was the kind of night that made you want to stay tucked under a blanket, listening to the storm rage outside. I was just drifting off to sleep, my eyes heavy, when the first noise broke the silence. Heavy breathing. Slow. Labored. Human. I shot up in bed, heart pounding. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I had heard. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the noise didn't stop. It was just outside, near the door, like someone was standing right outside my window. I felt my pulse in my throat as the sound grew louder, closer, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I glanced toward the door. It was locked, bolted from the inside, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A wave of cold washed over me, and I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, trying to steady my shaking hands. The breathing continued, slow, rhythmic, but unmistakably human. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal prowling nearby. I had seen raccoons and deer during the day. But this was different. It was too steady. Too deliberate. I lay there, frozen, listening. The sound didn't stop. It was too deliberate, too intentional, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside was waiting for something. For me. And then came the footsteps. Heavy, slow, and methodical, like someone was circling the cabin. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the drag of boots across the dirt, each step echoing in the dead of night. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I didn't acknowledge it, it would just go away. But it didn't. The footsteps continued, growing closer. Closer to the window now. I could almost hear the breath on the other side of the glass, the soft rasp of someone just inches away from me. I could hear the scrape of fingers against the wood as they walked, the sound sending icy chills up my spine. The wind had stopped. There was nothing now but the soft, steady sound of those footsteps. My heart hammered in my chest, and I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. It had to be. It had to be some figment of my imagination playing tricks on me. But when the doorknob rattled, my blood ran cold. It wasn't a gust of wind. It wasn't an animal. The handle shook again, more violently this time, as if someone was trying to force their way inside. I froze, holding my breath. My hands clutched the sheets tightly, knuckles white, as I silently begged for the door to hold. The rattling stopped, but the footsteps didn't. Now they were just outside the door, pacing in a circle, like they were waiting for something. Or someone. I wanted to scream, to call out, but I was too terrified to make a sound. The thought of revealing myself to whatever, or whoever, was out there paralyzed me. And then came the whisper. It was barely audible, a rasping voice that seemed to come from all around, like it was in my head. Cold and low, like something scraping the inside of my skull. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it was right beside me. "You're not alone." The voice sent a jolt of terror through my body. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a warning. An accusation. The breath on the other side of the window was louder now, closer, more suffocating. I wanted to hide. To run. But my body was frozen in place. My mind screamed, but my mouth couldn't move. The door rattled again, louder this time. I could hear the voice again, but it was different. It was closer now, and there was something almost pleased about it. "Let me in." I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should scream, run, or just wait. But then, silence. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. No voice. I waited, barely daring to breathe. The seconds felt like hours. I strained to hear, my heart still pounding in my chest, but the silence was deafening. Had it gone? Was it over? I slowly peeled myself from the bed, inching toward the window. My hand hovered over the curtain, trembling. I was terrified to look. terrified of what I might see, or what might see me. But when I pulled the curtain aside, there was nothing there. No shadow. No figure. Just the empty night. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The air was thick with tension, and I knew deep down that it wasn't over. Whatever had been out there, whatever had whispered to me, it was still watching. Waiting. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the door, the window, the walls. Every creak of the cabin felt like an intrusion, every gust of wind like the breath of something hungry. By morning, the sun had risen, but the fear hadn't left me. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of my mind, but I knew the truth. That night, something had come to my cabin. And I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps still come, soft but persistent, circling my cabin. The breathing. The whisper. I'm still here. And so is it. And I don't think it plans to leave. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of dread. I tried to shake off the fear, convinced I had imagined it all in my panic-stricken mind. But the truth lingered, gnawing at me. Something had been out there. Something had watched me, waiting in the darkness. The thought crept into every corner of my mind, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I decided to leave the cabin early. I packed my things quickly, desperate to get away from the place that had once seemed like the perfect retreat. As I stepped outside, the sun was high, but the forest around me felt cold and still, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing just beyond the reach of the sunlight. But the woods were empty. Silent. I hurried to my car, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I drove away, not daring to look back. But as I passed the edge of the woods, a chill washed over me. I could feel it then, that sense of being watched. And when I turned to glance in my rearview mirror, my heart stopped. There, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. A shadow, barely visible against the dark backdrop of the woods. It was still. Watching. I didn't stop to find out if it was real. I sped away, the sound of my tires on the gravel drowning out the thumping in my chest. But I could still feel it, those eyes, cold and empty, locked onto mine from the distance. I wasn't alone. Not then. Not now. And somehow, deep in my gut, I knew I would never be alone again. The visitor was still there, waiting. And it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. I arrived in the small town with the hope of a quiet retreat. The kind of place where the air smells fresher, the streets are deserted, and the only noise is the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. After hours of driving, my eyes were bleary, and my mind felt foggy. So when I saw the faded neon sign of a small motel by the side of the road, I figured it would be the perfect place to rest for the night. The motel was as worn down as everything else in the town, with peeling paint on the walls and an old rusted bell at the front desk. The clerk, an elderly man with hollow eyes, handed me a key without a word. His gaze lingered just a moment too long before I made my way to my room, a dull, cramped space with a single bed and a clunky, old landline phone sitting on the nightstand. There were no other guests that night, or at least none I saw. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the late hour. The room felt suffocatingly still, as if the air itself was thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. I pulled back the curtains, but all I could see was an empty street and a row of darkened buildings, silent and lifeless under the pale glow of a street lamp. I let out a deep breath, shut the curtains, and dropped my bag on the bed. I glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. It wasn't long before I sank into the bed, the sheets scratchy against my skin. My eyes fluttered shut, and the soft hum of the overhead fan lulled me into a light sleep. But that sleep didn't last. Something kept tugging at the edges of my consciousness, something that felt wrong, as though the town itself was holding its breath. I tossed and turned, trying to find comfort in the small, stiff bed, but the feeling wouldn't go away. And then, the phone rang. The sharp shrill sound cut through the silence, making my heart skip a beat. I jolted upright, blinking in confusion. Who could be calling me at this hour? There was no one I expected to hear from, and no one had mentioned anything about checking in. My first instinct was to ignore it. But then, I found myself reaching for the receiver. It was almost as if something was pulling me toward it. I hesitated for just a moment before I picked it up. The moment I did, the line went silent. Not a single breath, not a single sound. I waited, expecting a voice on the other end, but there was only silence. I thought about hanging up, but before I could, the whispering began. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Soft and cold, like ice scraping against metal, the voice on the other end of the line sent a shiver down my spine. You don't belong here. The words were barely audible, but they sent a ripple of unease through me. My grip tightened on the receiver, and I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing there. No one. The only sound now was the faint hum of the old motel fridge and my ragged breathing. Hello. I said, my voice shaky. I wasn't sure who I was expecting to answer, but I felt an intense need to break the silence. There was no response, just the sound of shallow, uneven breathing on the other end of the line. Then, the whisper returned, closer this time. Asterisk, you never should have come. Asterisk. My blood ran cold. I felt my pulse quicken, my chest tightening as fear began to seep in. My mind raced, desperately searching for a logical explanation. Maybe it was a prank, or some local trying to mess with me. But something in my gut told me it was far worse than that. I scrambled to think, but the words kept coming. You're not safe. The voice wasn't just speaking now, it was almost like it knew me. It was as if it had taken all my deepest fears and was playing them like a haunting melody. It knew I was alone, that I didn't know anyone in this town. It knew that I had no way of escaping, no way of getting help. Asterisk, they're watching. Asterisk. The words sent a fresh wave of panic flooding through me. My hands trembled as I gripped the phone harder, my mind reeling. The walls of the room seemed to close in on me, the air thickening. I glanced at the door. Could I run? But where would I go? I hadn't seen a soul since I arrived. I jumped when the phone clicked, the voice going silent for a moment. But before I could relax, the whispering started again, this time louder, more insistent. It felt as though the room itself was closing in, the walls drawing in on me, pressing the air from my lungs. I started to hyperventilate. Asterisk, they won't stop until you're gone. Asterisk. My body stiffened, dread settling deep in my bones. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, cloying. The whispers twisted in my head like a grotesque lullaby, suffocating me. Who is this? I choked out, but the words sounded weak and desperate even to my own ears. The phone line clicked again, but this time, something changed. The whispering didn't fade. It came from everywhere. It was as though the voice was inside my head now, the words slipping through my thoughts, settling into my deepest fears. You can't leave. I looked at the door again, my legs shaking as I pushed myself off the bed. My throat was tight, my breath shallow. I knew I had to leave, had to escape. But the door wouldn't open. I twisted the handle, yanked it, but it was as if the door had become part of the walls. My body was drenched in cold sweat now. I stumbled backward, eyes scanning the room wildly. The phone continued to ring, the shrill tone piercing the suffocating air. Asterisk, you're not leaving. Not until you understand. Asterisk. The whisper was a twisted promise. The walls were pressing closer, the air impossibly thick. The phone, which had seemed so ordinary when I entered, now felt like a cursed object. It had drawn me into its grip, and I couldn't break free. I glanced at the clock. It had been hours. It had only been hours. It felt like time was slipping, distorting. I couldn't tell if I was still awake, or if the town had swallowed me whole. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. I stood frozen, waiting for something, anything, but there was nothing. Only the deafening silence. I thought maybe I'd imagined it all, maybe I could leave. And then I heard it. The phone rang again. But this time, it was different. The line went dead, and the silence was replaced with a voice, chillingly clear and loud, as if it was right behind me. Asterisk, you will never leave. Asterisk. I spun around, but the room was empty. No one. Nothing. Yet the voice echoed, like it had been waiting, watching, biding its time. I reached for the door again, but it didn't open. I wasn't sure if it ever would. And the phone kept ringing. I backed away from the door, my legs like jelly beneath me. The room felt colder now, as though the very air had turned against me. The phone continued to ring, the sound vibrating through my bones, each chime more insistent than the last. Asterisk, you're not leaving. Asterisk, the voice whispered again, its tone mocking, victorious. I couldn't breathe. My mind was unraveling, the edges of my reality fraying into something dark and suffocating. I knew what was happening. I was being consumed by this place, by whatever force haunted it. There was no escaping the phone, no escaping the voice. It had wormed its way into my very soul, and I was trapped. I looked at the phone one last time, the receiver still resting on the nightstand, as though it was waiting for me to pick it up again. My hand hovered over it, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Not again. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out, but I was paralyzed, a puppet to the whispers that filled my head. Asterisk, you'll stay here, forever. Asterisk. The words seemed to grow louder, more oppressive, until they drowned out everything else. I wanted to scream, to break free, but my throat was tight, my voice stolen by the fear that had taken root deep inside me. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift, like the walls were bending, warping around me. The bed twisted into something grotesque, the furniture contorted, and the shadows in the corners grew impossibly long, stretching toward me like grasping hands. I tried to run. I tried to leave. But as my feet moved, they felt heavy, as though the floor was sucking me back in. It was too late. I heard the phone ring one more time, its sound now all-encompassing, drowning out everything in the room. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape. Asterisk, you'll never leave. Asterisk. The last whisper was a promise. I had been driving for hours, the rain beating down on the windshield, blurring the lines between the road and the world beyond. The GPS was useless out here, lost signals, and the headlights did little to cut through the downpour. The endless stretch of backcountry roads felt like they would go on forever, and the isolation of it began to wear on me. My mind started to wander, lost in thought, when it happened, a flash of something dark in the road, a wild swerve to avoid it, and then the sickening crunch as the car careened off the edge and into a ditch. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was alive or dead. I blinked, disoriented, blood trickling down my forehead from a cut on my temple. My chest tightened with panic as I tried to move, but the pain in my leg was immediate and intense. It felt like I had twisted my ankle, maybe broken it. I managed to push the door open, struggling against the water that had started to flood in, and stumbled out into the torrential downpour. The storm was relentless, sheets of rain soaking through my clothes almost immediately. My phone was dead, no signal. There was no choice but to start walking. I limped down the muddy road, the world around me nothing but rain and wind. There were no signs of civilization, no cars, no lights. Just the endless stretch of dark, wet land. Hours could have passed, or maybe just minutes. It didn't matter. My ankle was throbbing, and the storm didn't seem to show any sign of letting up. Then, through the haze of rain, I saw it. A dark silhouette of a building loomed in the distance, barely visible through the swirling mist. A farmhouse. I didn't hesitate. It was my only chance. It took everything in me to drag myself to the front steps. The house was old, decaying, but it was a roof, at least. The door hung ajar, creaking ominously in the wind. I pushed it open, hoping for warmth, shelter, anything. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust, but at least it was dry. I took a few tentative steps inside, my damp shoes squelching against the wooden floor. The house was dark and quiet. The floorboards groaned with each movement. There was no sign of life, no voices, no movement. Just the scent of mildew and something older. Something more unsettling. I pulled myself into the living room. The furniture was old and broken, some pieces overturned as if left in haste. But there was something else, strange marks in the dust. Long, dragged lines, like something had been moved through the room recently. I knelt down, tracing my fingers over them. These weren't just old disturbances, they were fresh. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease crawling up my neck. My mind screamed to leave, but my body was too exhausted to move. I had nowhere to go. I needed to keep moving, to find out what was in this house. I hobbled toward a hallway at the back of the living room, my ankle burning with each step. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. As I walked further down the hallway, the faint sound of something, dragging echoed faintly in the distance. I froze, my heart racing. I wasn't alone. The floor creaked underfoot, but I continued, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The hallway stretched on, leading to a door slightly ajar at the end. I approached it slowly, the scraping noise becoming louder with each step. I pushed the door open, and my breath caught in my throat. The room beyond was like something out of a nightmare. There was a bed, child-sized, covered in torn sheets. The walls were scrawled with what looked like desperate marks, scratches, deep gouges, as if something had been clawing at them for hours. The floor was covered in dust, except for a set of small footprints that led toward the corner of the room. My legs trembled. The footprints weren't old. They were fresh. I stepped forward cautiously, my gaze drawn to the far corner of the room. And then, I saw it. A handprint. A small, smeared handprint on the wall. The dark stain was unmistakable, and my stomach churned as I recognized it for what it was. It wasn't dust. It wasn't just dirt. It was something far worse. Blood. A noise above. A heavy thud, then the unmistakable sound of something, someone, moving across the floor. Slowly. Deliberately. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed, frozen in place by the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone in this house. I needed to leave. I turned and bolted for the door, my foot catching the edge of the floorboard and sending me tumbling to the ground. Pain shot through my leg, but I pushed myself up, desperate to escape. The sound of dragging was closer now, moving down the hallway toward me. I reached the back door, yanked it open, but the moment my hand touched the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. I screamed, yanking at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Someone, was holding it from the other side. Suddenly, the scraping sound was right behind me, so close I could feel the cold breath on my neck. The air thickened, suffocating, and a whisper, low and guttural, brushed against my ear. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The silence was deafening. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out everything else. And then, just as quickly, the dragging sound stopped. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Footsteps, soft and slow, echoed from above, and I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this place. Not with whatever was waiting for me in the shadows. My heart raced, my vision blurring as panic set in. I turned, ran for the front door, and threw my weight against it. This time, it gave way, the hinges creaking in protest as I stumbled out into the rain. The house loomed behind me, a dark figure against the stormy sky. I didn't stop running. I didn't dare look back. But even as I fled, I could hear it, the scratching. The whispering. The sound of something following, just beyond the edge of the dark. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It would never be over. Not as long as I had set foot inside that abandoned farmhouse. I didn't stop running. I didn't dare look back. The storm seemed to intensify as I pushed through the mud, my legs burning with every step, my ankle throbbing with each jagged movement. The farmhouse disappeared behind me, swallowed by the rain and darkness. But even as I fled, something gnawed at the edges of my mind, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, curling through the chaos of the storm. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was a voice. A voice I could almost hear, just below the roar of the tempest. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come here. Asterisk. I stumbled forward, the world a blur of shadow and rain, but the feeling, that cold, suffocating presence, lingered. It was as if the house was still watching me, waiting for me to turn around, to acknowledge it. To face whatever was left behind. I don't know how long I ran. My body had long since given up, but my mind kept pushing me forward, toward the faint glow of distant headlights, a sign of civilization, something that promised safety, a way out of this nightmare. I finally reached the road, collapsing onto the gravel in exhaustion, the sound of my labored breathing mixing with the storm. A car screeched to a halt in front of me, its headlights blinding, and the door swung open. "Hey, are you all right?" the driver called out, a man, his face a blur in the dim light. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I only nodded, unable to form anything coherent. He grabbed my arm, helping me to my feet. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could think about was that house, the way it had whispered my name, the way I had felt its eyes on me even as I fled. The driver must have sensed something was wrong, but before he could say anything else, the engine roared to life, and he sped off, taking me further from the farmhouse. But as we drove into the night, my heart heavy with dread, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The whispering didn't stop. It only grew louder in my head, as if the house had left its mark on me, a stain that would never wash away. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw it, a dark shape, standing in the distance, just at the edge of the road, illuminated by the fleeting light of the headlights. The farmhouse. It was still there. Waiting. And I knew then that no matter how far I ran, no matter how much time passed, the house would never let me go. It had claimed me, body and soul, and no escape could outrun the curse that it had cast. The whispers were right. I shouldn't have come here. And now, I couldn't leave.